Okay, welcome. Hello. This is the Datacolor 2013 webinar series. I'm David Tobie. I'm Global Product Technology Manager for the Spider products here at Datacolor. And I am here live in the same room with my partner David Saffir, who is a professional photographer from Southern California who has made the drive up here to Central Coast, California to work with me today. And our topic is going to be floral photography. Now, floral photography is an excuse we use for teaching photographic composition and technique, just like we do for anything else. It tends to scare away the high-end photographers who think, oh, that's kid stuff. And the answer is, you know, some of the best photographers I know shoot floral along with other things. So it's not just a beginner's technique. It's just a fantastic way of taking photography. So I'm going to be speaking about the slides in conjunction with David, probably on every slide, and because we're doing it that way, we're going to have fairly limited ability to answer any questions in real time because we're going to both be engaged with the slides and the actual presentation. Now we have Datacolor Spider Lens cow to give away at the end of the presentation, so stick around for that. Now, I'm really excited to announce that we have Lensbaby as a co-sponsor on this webinar because there's nothing that goes better with floral photography than Lensbaby. So we'll talk about their stuff a bit as we come upon it in the presentation. Now, David Saffir is actually running the slideshow, so I'm going to let him introduce himself and start moving the slides.
Hi everybody, this is David Saffir. I'm a commercial and fine art photographer and printmaker. I live in Southern California. I joined David up in San Luis Obispo for some work that we're doing here. So we're actually in the same studio together today, which is kind of a nice thing. And we're going to take turns talking a little bit about how each photograph was made, some of the elements of composition and color, and how you can use devices like the Lensbaby to enhance your art and your photography. So we'll go to the first one. And David, this one that it's one of yours. We're going to talk a little bit about contrast versus color and saturation.
When we shoot flowers, we tend to get wrapped up in color for good reason. So I picked this image not because it's the best Lensbaby shot I ever took, but because it emphasizes several things about floral photography. One is that it's possible to take a floral shot which is contrast-based, not saturation-based. This doesn't mean you have to turn it into a black and white photo. We typically think of like calla lilies as being the thing you shoot in black and white. This image would work in black and white. However, there's no reason to eliminate that wonderful watercolor of greens out of the image just to further emphasize the contrast of it. It's still a contrast-based image. And it's still a selective focus image. Of course, you'd have to be a Lensbaby shooter to really recognize this shot as being a Lensbaby shot. You'd just think it was a macro with a shallow depth of field. But it's easier to make this kind of macro shot and to get this kind of soft background with a Lensbaby than it is with most any other choice for macro shooting.
And I think the Lensbaby gives you a lot more control over that, David. In terms of your foreground and background and your middle point of focus. It's doing some of that hard work. If you were just using a macro lens, you would have to find just the right angle to capture that one plane of focus right in the middle. Versus using the Lensbaby, you can actually move that plane of focus up and down and left and right. One of the things I like about this image a lot is that it has color in it, and the colors are engaging and interesting in a subtle way. But to me, a lot of the appeal of this image is shape and form against a darker background, and the repeating nature of the forms and the slight splashes of color in between are very appealing to me. And you know, I think a lot of people would think, well, why wouldn't this be a black and white photo? I think it should be a color photo, but I also think that the design of it is particularly exquisite.
Okay, here we've moved on to a pair of images, one of mine, one of David's, that we can use to discuss depth of focus. Now I'll start with the Lensbaby macro on the left. Now this particular flower is some kind of a spider flower, I forget the type. It takes up a lot of volume and space. And if you take a flat two-dimensional photo of it, you know, it's just a whole bunch of prickles and spines in different directions plus the petals. So the beauty of this Lensbaby shot is it's kind of separated out the main body of the flower in space by having a plane in focus, and the stuff in the foreground is soft and softer, and the stuff in the background is softer still. So it's actually allowing you to slice a plane out of the three-dimensional form that makes this a more three-dimensionally engaging image because of the way that you've used depth of field and selective focus.
And one of the things, again, that I like very much about this image is the painterly quality of it, and the way that the colors in the background, even though they're blurred by the bokeh, are very reminiscent of the flower itself, and they serve to give the image a little bit more depth and a little bit more front-to-back interest. The image on the right is a field of flowers that I took, I think, a year ago up in the hill country near my home. And these flowers don't last very long. There's about a week where they're really looking nice, and a lot of those days aren't particularly good days in terms of light, so I was very lucky. A couple of pointers about this kind of image. First of all, the wind is not your friend, so windy days are particularly difficult. But getting down low and shooting across, a lot of people stand up or put the camera high on a tripod at eye level, and you can get a lot more mileage out of foreground-background interest by getting down low and then using a wider aperture to make the foreground sharp but the background to fall away in terms of focus. And so again, you get that painterly effect, the echoing of shapes. And in this particular image, there's kind of a curve from top right, takes your eye down to left middle right here, and then into the foreground. And it keeps your eye there. And so the composition of this in terms of where the flowers are placed in the image really helps make it a keeper. Now this is one of yours, David, that I particularly like. This is like you're being invited to walk in and sit down in the middle of the afternoon and enjoy yourself.
Yes, this is a fairly famous scene in southern Tuscany, and you can get a postcard that has most of what's in this image on it. And having shot the postcard shot myself many times, I was actually eating here with friends, and I had to stop in the middle of the meal and get my camera out and shoot this kind of deeper composition. And what's interesting about this is the yellows and the oranges that are now incorporated in the overhead and in the tableware tie into the yellows and the oranges, as muted as they are, in the stonework and the roofs, to kind of align that set of earth tones and to make the floral components the contrast color in that stripe across the middle, which is different than what you usually get. Normally you'd walk to the edge and the flowers would either be the foreground element, or you might actually look out over them and they wouldn't be included at all. Just get a landscape shot. So here there's more layers, more depth because of the inclusion of the terrace and the tables and the awning. And it makes, to my eye, a more interesting composition, but it also integrates the floral aspect into a larger whole.
I like the foreground, middle ground composition of this image very much. I think it gives it a lot of depth and a feeling that you could really walk into the scene. And I think a lot of people would do exactly what you had said, which is to walk forward past the tables and perhaps photograph the flowers in the foreground and the buildings in the background. It would be fairly interesting, but from back here at this vantage point, it really makes the image seem three-dimensional to me.
Well, speaking about three-dimensional, here we've got a shot of a Lensbaby because we wanted to talk about the different types. This is a ball and socket Lensbaby, and this has certain limitations and certain advantages. Now the advantage is you can set this up on a tripod and you can pivot it and it will stay in place, and you can shoot multiple images with that exact same focus and that exact same shot. You can adjust the focus while having the center of focal location remain the same. You can change other camera settings and repeat your shots. This is not something you can do with the more artistic Lensbabies. The original Lensbabies had what we used to describe as kind of a vacuum cleaner hose, that connected the lens to the body. And that type of Lensbaby is more flexible and allows you to stretch it forward to do macros and allows you to get distortion on multiple axes, which, is tricky stuff to control. So there's a much greater degree of randomness in those photos. You have to shoot a lot and pick what you like. Whereas this type of Lensbaby with the ball and socket, this composer allows you to actually compose in the camera and get some consistency in what you get out. So my pitch here is there's no such thing as having enough Lensbabies. You really ought to have the macro attachments. You ought to have a ball and socket one. You ought to have an artistic version. Once you start buying Lensbaby gear, you get rapidly addicted and you'll end up owning multiple Lensbaby products the same way I did.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking is that my style of shooting, which you sometimes make fun of, is that when I'm doing fine art work, I like to use a tripod. I have a medium format camera, and I like to work off a tripod as a base. And, of course, I have a Nikon DSLR, and I'm still adjusting. I just got the Lensbaby Composer, and I'm still adjusting my style a little bit to shooting handheld because I like to slow down and take my time and compose things. And so in amongst your choices for the different Lensbaby models, one might think about shooting style. If you do like to shoot off a tripod and take your time with the camera, maybe the Composer is the one to start with. If you're more of a spontaneous, energetic shooter and you're moving around a lot, one of the other models that David mentioned might be your first choice, and then you can add to your bag later on. But it's really something to think about in terms of matching your style to the Lensbaby model that you want to get.
Well, I'd have to add to that, David, they've got a new one out. They've got one I don't have yet. They've got the slice, which kind of takes a slice out of your image to put it in focus. So, of course, I've got to get one of those, and of course I'm going to have to play with it and see what you can do with the new slice model. It's like salt peanuts.
So freezing motion. It's a perfect day for freezing motion, David.
Yeah, it is in fact a day outside here that looks much like the day that this photo was captured. So you've got all the sunlight you can use. You can shoot at ISO 100. You can shoot at high shutter speed, and that means the wind won't necessarily blur your images. And here's this extra advantage. You can freeze motion. And there's no such thing as flowers without bees and insects, because that's the whole purpose of flowers. So there's always this interaction between the two. And to see this bee making, no pun intended, a beeline, and his legs are weighted down with pollen and he's headed for a thistle. And so there's a story here that kind of transcends the simple image of thistles against the sky. So that bee really adds a lot to me.
Yeah, I like the shot. I like the way the bees fly when they're totally intoxicated on fermented nectar. I really like this photograph. This is another one of David's. And David, I'm going to jump in for just a minute. And he's going to talk about color, but I want to talk about design because I really like the side-by-sides of rectangular and square shapes to circles. And you can see right here that going from left to right that there's triangles being created that climb right to the upper right-hand side of the photograph. And so, again, elegant design is in play here. We've also got some great textures behind one side, which adds a lot of visual interest. And then we go to a totally different texture on the right side. So there's this mix that normally wouldn't work, but the reason is the way David used color in this photograph.
Yeah, this is a challenging image, and sometimes challenging is a good thing, but like David says, there's almost two separate images here. There's bicycle against bare wall, and then there's floral riot, and the two are rather different, and there's about 4 inches of overlap in the middle where the bicycle tire overlaps the flower pot, or the leaves from one of the plants overlap the other wall. So there's this kind of fun tension created between the two. Now what I've done to play up that tension is to attempt to build a color relationship so strong that even people who aren't color fanatics will notice it. In other words, there are these kind of unusual hot pinks and greens in this bicycle. And if you look, there are, you know, hot pinks and greens in the floral at the right. They're not unusual there. They're normal for that. But the thing that stopped me dead in this little narrow alley in Tuscany was the color relationship. And my first question was, can I get a composition that works out of this? David seems to think I managed. But my other question is, do I have a lens wide enough to capture all this? Because this is like a 6-foot wide alley, and I'm trying to stand flat up against the wall with my head back against the masonry in order to get a shot that captures all of this at once.
It's a good one. This is another one where I'll talk a little bit about design, and then David will kick in. I like the design of this large versus small, and a triangular shape versus a rectangular shape, and of course the textures in the photograph. And I think this is really a sweet image. This is a little snip of somebody's life, and a lot of loving care went into that flower box in the flower pot, and it's just a little taste of what living there could be like. I really enjoy this one.
Well, this is not your typical Tuscan shot. This looks more like Sicily or Puglia or someplace a little poorer than Tuscany, and it's not the, you know, the beautiful rich stonework. This is cheap concrete stucco that wasn't even, they didn't even bother to put any colorant into it. They just parched it on right out of the bag. And so it has a poor look. And the decay, the fact that the whitewash is chunking off the window frame, the fact that the flowers are not prospering as they typically do in Tuscany, makes this a kind of a unique Tuscan image. And it had just rained, so the rain had soaked in differentially into the uncoated stucco. And that's what stopped me dead, was these wild textures on this wall that's otherwise this kind of sad story. So when I shot this, I was with my closest European friend, and when he saw the photo that evening, he referred to this, pardon my language, as, oh, one of those damn American photos. I knew just what he meant. You know, the flat window or door photo is something that we love and that they think is quite trite. The idea for me is to not avoid the trite images, it's to transcend them. We'll come to a sunflower shot of mine later on in this series that hopefully manages to transcend the trite as well.
Why don't you go ahead?
Well, the reason he's asking me to go ahead is he has no clue what this is a picture of.
It's green, it's blue.
Well, what this is, what makes, and I'm big on photos as puzzles. For certain uses, advertisements being an obvious one, to have an image that draws you in because you can't figure out what's going on is very valuable. And so this image it's young ferns. That's obvious. But what's going on? They look like they're on a piece of formica or something. This is a bluestone mill wheel.
Whoops, pardon me.
Bluestone mill wheel that has been laid flat on the ground, and since it has a hole in the middle, of course, eventually something grew up through that hole in the middle. So we're looking at the side of an old millstone with lichens growing on it. And what's so interesting, of course, is that the stone is so blue and that the lichens take that on as they grow. So this is one of those photos where I would be accused of lying, cheating, and stealing when it comes to the colors. And the answer is, well, I only stole them from nature. This actually looks like this. But the unique color and the undecipherable nature of the content just makes it an engaging image. So that's, like I said, particularly for advertisements and places like that where you want to capture people's attention through the undecipherable, this is just the kind of image that works for that.
Now, classically, the rule of thirds puts the flower in the position that you see it. What's interesting to me is the use of focus, again, in this image, brings your eye into this area on the left, and then as the eye, because we're in a culture that reads left to right, the eye tends to wander off, but because this is much softer, the eye comes back around. And then, of course, you have this shape, very distinctive against a very heavily textured green background, and it really makes it work as a photograph. And you were talking before about commercial photography. Certainly there's enough room, for example, upper right here for copy. And there's art directors that would glom onto this in a heartbeat.
Add. Go ahead, David.
Okay, go forward. Sure.
So again, this is a Lensbaby shot, and what is interesting about it is we all know the symmetry of the daisy, or in this case the brown-eyed Susan. And we'll see other shots, multiple shots of brown-eyed Susans in this presentation. But what's happened here is we've come in close enough and gotten off-axis enough that the static, sun-shaped form of this flower has become a dynamic off-center composition instead.
Yeah, I really like this image. The textures in the center, it almost looks like the parts of the flower there are moving, and then the way the out of focus elements are positioned, that also looks like it's perhaps moving in the breeze or flying through the air. It's really pretty dynamic for a floral shot.
Well, I warned you there'd be more. Now, what makes this shot unique is a different thing. This camera, to do this with a DSLR, one would have started by destroying somebody's flower bed and digging a hole in the dirt and putting the camera in the hole to get down here, and then you would have been shooting blind. And you can go on about how one would do this, and the answer is, get your iPhone out of your pocket, hold it down on the ground, push the button. So there are things you can do with a phone that you can't do with a camera, and so it just gives you certain advantages. And this advantage is simply to lay on the ground under the flowers and look up at the sun without having to ruin somebody's flower bed to do it.
I think this is really a great I really like this composition.
This gets interesting because we're talking about patterns, and I'll discuss the pattern of mine on the left, and then I want David to discuss his pattern on the right, because they're there for very different reasons. They're both shot with a Lensbaby, and they're gaining different things from that. The one at the left has, again, a symmetrical floral form, which usually what we do with those powerful geometries of flowers is we then make organic compositions out of them, like the shot before, where there's a lot of asymmetry and a lot of dynamicness in the location of the flowers, since each flower itself is this powerful little symmetrical unit. So here, we've actually created a symmetrical image out of the symmetrical flowers, and it adds a lot of power. The fact that you've got this cross created by flowers with this flower in the middle that reflects that, that just creates a very strong form for the image, and a bit unusual, which is also a value.
I like the pattern that's created right in the center of this particular flower, the way the petals fall away with the really gentle curves, and they curve all the way across left to right, and then you have this beautiful spiral on the center of the flower, which is really nice. And then, of course, those shapes, those forms, that part of the design are reflected not only in the flowers right, left, top, center, but also in the leaves, etc., that surround them. So it's really quite a nice. Most complicated compositions like this don't pull it off, but this one certainly does. The flower on the right, of course, is a rose, and I was using a Lensbaby composer, and I was trying to shoot the whole flower, and I suddenly realized that shooting the whole flower was not only a cliche, but it wasn't working. The flower wasn't in the greatest shape to begin with. And so I got closer and closer and closer, and all of a sudden it turned from a flower into a seascape with waves rushing into shore around a rock. And I thought, well, that's really a different view of a flower. And this is how it turned out. And I thought it was a pretty good experiment. And my point is that you can find patterns, and sometimes you have to get closer to find the pattern, and sometimes you have to get farther away. Also, a little tip about focusing when you're very close with a manual focus lens like a Lensbaby is that those really fine adjustments, sometimes they're better made by moving the camera forward and back just a little bit rather than trying the focus ring. It's an old trick with macro lenses. It works great with the Lensbaby, and you just move back and forth and in and out, and I suggest that you take multiple shots, because it's hard to see where your best point of focus is going to be when your plane of focus is like a slice, as David pointed out before. So again, don't be afraid to experiment. Move back and forth and side to side a little bit, and you know, that's a lesson for me to get the camera off the tripod, of course.
Well, here's one where the image on screen is a little too small to do the image justice, because these are ladies' mantle leaves, and they have this edge that is textured, and every single point on that edge has a dewdrop on it, and that's what makes this image is of course the water and the dewdrops. But again, this is shot with a Lensbaby so that it creates focus in a particular area of the image, and wonderful, you know, eat it with a spoon blurs and colors in the rest of the image. And it's just the kind of close-up stuff that it's fun to explore. You can get out there and get your knees wet and wander around and take some of these dew shots first thing in the morning.
It's like it has jewels on the edge. I really like this photograph. Go ahead.
Well, I often talk about raw tools and their power, and the fact that they give you a lot of control, and that the flip side of control is responsibility. And I think that that's actually Spider-Man's, yeah, that's his logo. But at any rate, the fact is, it would be easy to take this image and to make the background in this image black, because it's dark enough. You can just slide the control over and you end up with flowers on a black background. It's very dramatic, but there's actually, and of course it's a little hard to see. I'm seeing JPEG compression through this webinar viewer, but the background of this has texture in it, and it has a warm, earthy tone. And there's detail and information in there that adds richness to the image that would be lost if you simply clipped that all to a perfect black.
I like the gradient background. I can't think of the right word at the moment, but I like that. It also speaks to me of a live shot, one that's not completely contrived. The light is obviously coming from the side, but there's also reflected light coming from underneath, which I like very much. It's very much true life, I think. It's got real luminance to it that spills into the background, so it's very believable. One of the other things I like about this is that a lot of people tend to shoot things in even numbers. Try shooting things with odd numbers, 3s and 5s, for example. They're generally stronger from the standpoint of composition, and in this case, it works really well with 2 flowers close together and 1 flower offset a little bit, and the 1 flower not quite having opened versus the other 2, which are well on their way. So you've got a lot of variation in your subject, and yet they are all the same thing. So it's really quite a nice photograph.
So this is the classic dizzying Lensbaby focus effect, and it's the thing that a Lensbaby does best. It's the thing the Lensbaby does most often, and it can be overused. You want to not have every Lensbaby shot you take do this. However, it does it so well that you've got to do it. And when you do, you should do it with something that justifies it. Here you've managed to get 1 sprig of flowers and the butterfly in focus, and everything else is this dizzying blur. And so it just gives you this summer day feeling that is delicious.
It really does, and it also gives me the feeling that there's a little breeze and that flower's bobbing around in the breeze. It's just a summer day in a photograph.
And you know there were 100 photos taken, and this one was selected from them. It's you know, the breeze is blowing, the butterfly's not in position. You know, he flies off, and you have to find another one. So you know, it's just it's trial and error shooting at its best.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely true. It's all about being willing to experiment, and since we're all shooting digital with this, it's easy, and it's absolutely worth taking the time to do.
So here I say context, but what we're really looking at is 2 perfectly good subject matters making 1 better image. There's a nice architectural shot of a pretty half house in Princeton. There's a beautiful flowering plant in full bloom. It'd be very easy to just walk up to the branches of this plant and get lost in them and shoot macros and shoot close-ups and shoot nothing but flowers. but by stepping back and managing to get a composition. You know, you're in the city, you've got phone lines, you've got cars by the street, there's all sorts of challenges to getting a decent in-town composition. So here you've got an image, you know, if I do say so myself, a Better Homes and Gardens image, you know, the kind of shot that would go into a house magazine. And it's stronger for having the floral components in the architectural, and it's a stronger floral image for having the architectural components in that. You can contrast them.
And the way that you photograph the building gives really strong structure to the entire photograph. If you look at what he did, and this is sort of breaking the rules to make the photo better, he centered the front point of the house in the photograph. And then you have the diagonals leading off, right and left, and peeking up above, and then the garage in the back, I assume that's what that is, has the same shapes. And so it's not symmetrical, it's asymmetrical, but it's well balanced because of the weights of the two sides, left and right, work together to balance the image. If you notice on the left, there's a tree, which balances the mass of the flowers on the right. So it's a very, very well-balanced, well-thought-out image. I don't see this as a snapshot. I see this as, like you said, Better Homes and Gardens quality. It's something to think about if you're in this kind of situation.
The purpose of flowers is pollination, and the main means of pollination is bees, insects, hummingbirds. So bees are not simply something that you might accidentally occasionally see when you're shooting flowers. They're really an integral part of the flower story. So what I'm agitating for here is, even though the bee is not the center of focus or the center of attention in this image, I still prefer the image that has the bee in there in the background to the one that doesn't, because it just enriches the story.
So let the bee stay. Look at this pair. Shall I go first this time?
Please.
Paired these together. These photographs were taken at completely different times for completely different reasons. David's image is on the left and mine is on the right. But they both use depth of focus in the same way, which is to bring the viewer's attention to a certain point in the photograph. And they both use the bokeh, the blurred background, in a certain way, which is to provide a place for the eye to go and then come back to the point of interest in the photograph. Both flowers are pretty much at the same point in their development, which is kind of interesting. And they both have elements which sort of arc away from the main body, which give them a feeling of energy. So I just think it's very interesting that two different people, at least a year apart, took images that have a lot of the same compositional intent and really the same feeling for me anyway. Go ahead, David.
Well, you've brought that out nicely. The tip of the bud is the key point in both images, and it's surrounded by things that reinforce it all the way to the background colors. Both of these have a warm and a cool background color that's deliciously out of focus and that bring your eye back, as you say. It's interesting because the rose is such a clean flower, and the geranium bud is so messy and covered with hairs, and it's like a little spider. And so the comparison of the two is richer than either of them alone. But if you look at either of those images, but it's easier in this case perhaps in the left one, 3/4 of this image is completely out of focus. It's an abstract impressionist canvas that you get to paint as long as you remember to put one thing in there so that your conventional viewer will not be uncomfortable with the fact that this is an abstract impressionist painting, that there's something in there. He says, so that the literal-minded person says, oh, it's a geranium bud. Well, no. It's a big swath of soft color. Oh, that has a little point of focus that's a geranium bud.
That's a good point, is that literal-minded viewer has to be helped across the bridge, so to speak. I like that. I like that thought. That's a good thought. Windowboxes.
You go.
Okay. The story about the window box on the right is kind of a nice one. Is that I was lucky enough to be in Paris in the summertime, and we were staying in a hotel that looked across a very narrow street, and I looked out the window, and there was obviously this spot that somebody came to regularly and enjoyed the late afternoons, which were just beautiful that time of year. And so they had a little flower box, and I'm sure they would come out with a glass of wine and open the windows and enjoy the breeze. And the other thing I think is very charming about this is that there isn't a single straight line in the architecture, is that everything is cockeyed here, from the roof lines to the, I guess you call it a gable over the window, and the windows are probably make a lot of noise when you open them, but it's just that it's got that touch of humanity with the flowers in it and such. So it's not this stark urban landscape, but it's obviously a place that someone goes to enjoy life.
Yeah, my image on the left is just a proof of all David's statements on the right. I mean, this is a more or less rectangular building in which you'll see there's not actually a single straight line. It's an old barn on the Maine coast. Somebody's equally loving and caring. I mean, a window box is a commitment. You know, flowers in the ground might grow by themselves, but if you don't water that window box regularly, it will die. So there's always a human presence with a window box. Now, I don't have a window that someone's going to open and smoke a cigarette that has a permanent ashtray outside like in David's image, but you can see that somebody comes by with a watering pot, you know, every 2 or 3 days at least, and waters this and takes care of it and prunes it and crops it and all. And so there's that human form. And, of course, a window offers human scale innately. So all of this kind of adds up to this, you know, sense of life without including, you know, the human form.
Yeah, they're both really sweet images.
So there's a flowering plant in this shot. Does anybody care? I mean, the flowering plant in there is so undramatic and uncolorful that it by itself doesn't make much of a photograph. The reason for stopping and shooting this image was not the flowering plant. It was the wild yellow lichens growing on the rocks. That's the color. That's the texture is the stone and the patterns at the edges of that lichen. And the flower is the accent here, not the theme. I mean, if the shot had been taken 6 inches higher, there'd be no flowers in it. It would be a weaker composition, probably for the fact that it was nothing but a piece of stone with lichen on it. So the mixture of those compositional elements. And David, I bet, is going to go on and talk about how the eye works and the composition in here. But that was the reason. The thing that stopped me to shoot this was the combination of those lichens and those little plants surviving in a hostile environment here.
You know, one of my first comments to David when I saw this image was that it almost looks like an undersea shot, and the lichens look like starfish, and the flowers at the bottom look like plants growing on the seabed. And so I was transported from the shore to the sea. And maybe that's just my imagination, but the shape of the lichens really, for me, makes this photograph particularly interesting. And, of course, I like the shapes, the way this triangle works and is resonant of the shapes here and the lichens in the middle and then down below, shapes of the flowers and that sort of thing. And again, when you're looking at an image, think about design, think about shapes and geometry, and shapes and geometry can come from the objects in the image, shapes and geometry can come from light and shadow. So keep those things in mind when you're composing your photographs, and your photographs will become more and more interesting. Go forward, yeah? Okay, go ahead.
Dead flowers. Now, you're in the middle of Tuscany. You're in the middle of Tuscany, and everything is gorgeous. And do you have the consciousness to say, wait, in the other direction, right into the face of the sun, I've got a high contrast, glary image of last year's flowers. You know, the old dried flower heads sitting there. This is, from a graphic designer's point of view, from the people who buy your photos to put them in magazines and articles and newsletters and all, this is probably a more usable photo than the one I took in the other direction, because, you know, this is high contrast. It expresses things that a floral shot doesn't normally express. You know, so keep in mind that it's good to shoot the widest possible array of emotions and forms and shapes, not just the most colorful, prettiest stuff. And again, what was the first slide? Shoot for contrast as well as color?
Yeah, here you go. You know, I was thinking as you were speaking, and I don't know if you'll appreciate this comment, but this also looks a little bit like War of the Worlds. The aliens are attacking.
Yeah, exactly. But it's that level of kind of tension and hostility that makes this a strong image.
It's a spiky one.
Yeah.
It's a spiky one. I like it a lot. Ah, the critters. Now, you wouldn't normally think that to get a photograph with a snail in it that you'd have a foot race, but there was. I walked outside my mother's house, and she had these very, very large cactus that flower once a year for about a day and a half or 2 days at most. And I walked by and it's covered with dew, and then I realized there's this little snail that just makes the photograph. And he's moving, it's the world's fastest snail. He's moving so fast, I don't have a camera, that I may not get the shot, so I had to run in the house. And I'm thinking, this is sad that there's a snail that's too fast for me. And I actually got back in time, got the macro lens mounted, and got 2 shots off before he disappeared. But I really like, I have photographs of this flower in other instances, and it's a beautiful flower, but with the, you know, the animal in it, to me it really gives the photograph a sense of scale. That snail is about the size of a eraser on a pencil. It gives you some sense of how big the flower is. And of course all the dewdrops give a lot of texture that balances against the texture on the upper left. And this also looks like an underwater shot to me with the main body in the center of the flower.
You beat me to it. I was going to say this is underwater.
Looking like a sea anemone.
Yeah.
So this is one of my all-time favorites from a personal standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, there's very much an under-the-sea effect. This is water, and snails are thought of as an undersea animal as well, and boy, is that an anemone or a starfish there. That's
it's
great.
A crazy-looking plant, I'll tell you.
Well, both of these are water shots. One of them in the form of dew in a very dry place, seldom has it, and the other one in the form of a permanent year-round pond, clearly, because water lilies require that. The race on the left is interesting, but it's the balancing act on the right, because of course this is a vertical shot down onto lily pads, which means somewhere in the background is a photographer hanging a very expensive camera out over the water. But the result of that, of course, is very strong, powerful geometries that are flattened by looking straight down on them. So this is contrast. I mean, the whole image is green except for the pink lily. The whole image is flat except for the lily and the frog. So there's this animal versus plant, upper left, lower right. So there's all these relationships in here. By having a fairly abstract photo, it strengthens the geometry and the relationships of what's left.
One of the things that I like about this, and I have to think it's an accident, but the frog is positioned right at the apex of this triangle, which is just as perfect as it could be. And of course, the frog is pointed directly at the flower. So there's some little bits of geometry going on in here that really appeal to me in terms of balance and energy. And of course, rule of thirds, the frog is in the upper left, rule of thirds, the flower is in the lower right. It's like something you would teach at university level with this image.
So how many shots did I take of butterflies on these Mexican sunflowers? It's a breezy day. You're gonna take 100 shots and wonder if you'll get one. So what one did I pick? The sunflower and the butterfly are not in the sun. The butterfly does not have his wings in the classic upright, pretty position. What entranced me about this shot, again, this is a contrast shot. First thing this is contrast. Second thing it is color. But there were relationships here. The color of the sunflower and the color of the butterfly, the form of the arched open flower and the butterfly arching his open wings down. I mean, this is a rare butterfly photo rather than the one we showed earlier, which was pretty, but it's the typical butterfly photo. So the reason I chose this one is it is a very rare and difficult image, even challenging to look at, rather than being, the pretty easy, simple butterfly shot.
Yeah, I really like the replication of forms and colors in this. It's unusual to see it like this, and it's pretty unique. I also like the clouds in the background. They're very, very, very soft. They're almost surreal. Uh, Now this is one that reminds me of water. These look like dewdrops to me. And I really like this center of focus effect. You know, the rule says never center anything. But in this case, it works perfectly well. You have all these circular shapes converging in the center of the image, and it's very much, to me, very much a water image of very soft colors, very rounded shapes. And of course, the drop off of focus in the background is really appealing.
And of course, it's a Lensbaby.
Shall I go forward? I'm not sure how many slides are left. How close are we getting?
I'll talk about this one a bit while you're figuring that out. This is a field full of wildflowers. Do you see them? Nah, neither do I. If you print this thing, 3 feet wide on canvas, yes, there is a sea full of wildflowers there. But even then, it's not enough. This is a meadow with trees. And the only reason this image has a successful composition is because of the extra element. Now, the classic thing to do with an image like this is to have a model take her clothes off and stand there, and then you have a photo that's got another element in it, a little bit trite perhaps, but another element in it. But here what we have is the incredibly powerful element of the unexpected and of humor. I mean, this is a funny shot. There's no question about it. This is a throwaway joke shot. It's good composition, it's a beautiful image, and in a large print it does have a lot of wonderful flowers in it, but it's not the yellow of those little tiny wildflowers that are the contrast color in this image. It's the red of the phone box. So this is very successful, even if it is kind of a set shot. I mean, that phone booth was put there for pretty much this reason.
Yeah, but it's really, somebody has a classic sense of humor. Put a phone box out in the middle of the forest. It's also a very English thing to do, I think.
I have been accused of having an English sense of humor prior to this.
Now, David's really deep into the art world, and so it's no surprise that we see an Impressionist style photograph. I like taking photographs like, I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in here, David. I like taking photographs like this too, because they sort of give you an opportunity to put yourself in a scene and tell your own story. In other words, the story, it's a canvas for you to step into. It's not necessarily a story in a capsule. And so it's a little bit unique. Most photographers won't go down this path, but I found that meadow shots with wildflowers like this can be really satisfying.
Yeah, the danger here is there's what we call texture shots or background shots. Graphic designers, as I said, love them. You don't have to make the perfect fine art image in order for people to buy it and use it, because it's the start to their art form rather than being the completion in your own. And yet, 4 feet wide on canvas, hanging on the wall, nobody's going to miss the Impressionist impact of this. I mean, it will be understood that this is an ode to Monet if you do that. And there's this slider in Lightroom, the present slider, and what you normally do with it is crank it way over to the left and make things turn into an etching. If you crank it towards the right, it turns them into this soft, incredibly smooth, glowing type of result. That's how this was done. The only, other than getting the exposure right and the saturation right, the only adjustment that was done to this image is to move that present slider to the left and soften everything.
All right. Oh, yes.
So here we got another bee. He's not the center of focus of the image, and yet he's part of the world it's in. So we're celebrating him at the same time that we're making, this would be a powerful composition. In fact, I think we have another macro of another poppy with a different colored center in here just on its own. But this is even a stronger story than you might think, because where the wing of the bee connects to the bee on the side of his thorax, looks like his throat from here, there's actually a little circle there. That's what a parasite on this bee. That's a parasite that kills bees. So this story is, the happy story of the flower, the happy story of the bee in the flower, the less happy story of bee die-off. So there's many, many levels here. This is a phone photo. It was shot with a phone, it was processed on a phone, it was published from the phone. It's one of the things that phones do best. iPhones take great macros.
Poppies. It's almost time for the poppies in California. In about 6 weeks, if we get a little more rain, we should have the poppies. This is in Tuscany, right?
Yeah, this is, it's funny because there are a redder poppy in northern Europe, and then there's this classic orange or Tuscan poppy, and then there's that wonderful orange butter yellow California poppy. I love them all. I'm a poppy lover anywhere. I like the 4-leaf ones and the 6-leaf ones and all the different kinds of centers in them. I've never found a poppy I didn't like, including the little mixed color poppy batches that they grow next to the sidewalk in Las Vegas. Even Vegas has its redeeming floral characteristics. So here, this is classic to anyone who's been to Tuscany, because what you're seeing here is the grain and the poppy. And it's the poppies in the grain fields and the grains as weeds in the poppy gardens, that kind of make this mix classic. And yes, I could have shot something like the previous shot, a close-up of the poppy or even a macro of part of the poppy. But to me, the story here is the jaggediness and the kind of the yellowy greenness of the young grain versus the smoothness and the incredibly warm color of the poppy. So it's the contrast, the field event. Even though the field is made up of all sorts of other events, they're actually more textured and more detailed than the poppy is. So that's what makes that work for me. And yes, David, I didn't follow the rule of thirds. I stuck my flower right exactly square in the middle.
I also like the textures side by side in this, and of course the opposition of colors very much. The cat is alive, everybody, just so you know.
This is not your dead cat in the middle of the road. We often think of one-point perspective as being an architectural element, and there is, a grid being formed here by the trellis for the grapevines in this garden. So there is some architectural reference, but what we're seeing here is numerous elements in this photo. We put the animals in. We used contrast. We have a powerful one-point perspective. We have light-on forms in space. We have dark areas that are mysterious. All these things. And so the image is a kind of a rich, convoluted story that's about shadows and colors and flowers and animals. And yes, I had to pet this cat considerably before it just kind of fell over and laid there to photograph it. So this is not a simple image making one point, but one of the things that works with it is one-point perspective, having everything disappear to the center of the back.
And just from a composition standpoint, you've got some interesting, unconventional things going on here, which is the flowers are leaning into the photo from the right side, and you have all of these shapes over here, almost serpentines, completely opposite, yet they're almost talking to each other diagonally across the photo. And then you have these other diagonals, intersecting ones, going down the path. And of course the shadows left to right, and the cat, being very sophisticated, has lined herself up perfectly for David's photograph. And we were going to talk a little bit about experimenting here. This is one of David's images, and obviously unconventional, but there's a couple of interesting things going on here. First of all, just take a look at the flower and the clouds that seem to be coming out of it. And I think that alone makes the image for me. I think that's just one of the most interesting things he could have done with this and blurring the foreground and having the background be sharp is kind of an inversion of what most people would do. Most people would make the flower sharp and let the background fall away. But David did the opposite, and I think although it's an unconventional image, it really does work, in part because of this subtlety up here with the flower and the clouds, but also simply because it's a completely different way of looking at this landscape.
Yeah, the way I look at this is the traditional thing to do here is to put on a wide-angle lens with nearly infinite depth of focus and get the whole thing in focus. And today the answer to that is you put on a tripod, which would be quite a challenge on the side of this rock, and shoot this in multiple exposure if the wind's not blowing, so that you can get multiple planes of focus and sandwich them together synthetically in Photoshop and have a perfectly focused image from front to back. And when you're done, it just looks like it came out of National Geographic. Nobody's going to, really give you a lot of credit for the work you went to. What's happened here is I've been far lazier than that. It's a single composition and the single shot. And the question is simply, do I really dare to publish an image which has its highest color, highest contrast, area of powerful interest out of focus? And the answer is, there are those people who look at this and say, duh, what photographer took this? The flower's out of focus. Those aren't the people I'm interested in anyways. It's the people who actually notice the flower and the cloud. I mean, this is a photo of a beautiful Tuscan hillside village falling off to the valley below where they grow the most prized wine in Italy, and you can go on and on. But it's really ethereal. It's the stuff above the horizon line in this photo. No matter how gorgeous the stuff below the horizon line, it's the stuff up above that the picture's about. Eventually, if you look at this long enough, you realize it's about the poppy and the cloud.
Another phone photo.
Well, this one shows as being a phone photo by having the border on it and by having kind of a certain phony effect. And yet, you can love them, you can hate them, but they're there. People are going to take phone photos, and the answer is, I can out Instagram your Instagram photo without ever using Instagram. And what this does that Instagram will not do is it's not a square. Now, anybody who grew up running a Hasselblad like David did has nothing against static square and nearly square images. However, being restricted to that as your only form factor, I object.
Well, there's a lot to be said about that, but that's a battle to be fought another day. I particularly like the way the center point of this is not the center point. In other words, you could say compositionally that it's on center, and yet the flowers are all pointing away from the center point, the axis of the lens. And that's what makes this photograph interesting to me, is that it has a completely unique point of view. And of course, being relatively shallow depth of field, the background isn't distracting. If the background was sharper, I think it would be a very cluttered looking image, but it works in part because the main plane of focus is near the front, so to speak, of the main subject. Dark, rich florals. Just a couple of quick comments. One of the things I like about this is the way the focus falls away very quickly, and so really the sharpest point is like the photographs with the bud is right in the middle of this particular area, and the rest of it is kind of up to grabs as far as your imagination goes. It falls away, it gets softer and softer and softer, and then you have no idea what's really back there. The contrasting colors, which is something you don't often see, really make this look dimensional and not as flat as it would otherwise be. And so that high saturation, high contrast situation brings that flower almost out of the photograph into your lap.
Yeah, and of course this is shot with a Lensbaby specifically to get that kind of control. And all I did was duck underneath the overhanging greenery to get in where there was some darkness and some richness and some deep tones here.
I like the details in the highlight too.
Yeah.
FishEye Lens, why don't you go ahead?
Well, we'll do this quickly. We're getting near the end of the webinar, but all this is an Ola clip stuck onto an iPhone and shot as a macro. Now, Lensbaby has some macro lenses that they offer that will give you the same kind of effect, though not, of course, in a phone photo. They haven't made a Lensbaby for my iPhoto yet. If they'd made a Lensbaby for my iPhone, I would own one, believe me. So this is the kind of effect you get from a macro. You're staring at this thing like a fisheye, And yet, in this case, because of the geometry of the flowers and whatnot, that's, you get this really wonderful pom-pom effect from it, and it is satisfying. And yet another iPhone photo. The brilliance here, this is a six-pointed poppy instead of the four-leaf poppy, but the thing that just struck me is, of all the poppies in the garden, they're kind of mixed. These are mutts. They're ones that volunteered on their own. Just this one poppy has this purple center, and none of the others did. And I said, gotta shoot that. And the only camera I have with me, of course, is the iPhone. So therefore, I now have an iPhone macro of the inside of a poppy with purple core.
The shadows. Just another, circling back to that same point about experimentation. This is a shadow that works really well. You could almost imagine that this is a monster movie, and the poor photographer is taking pictures, and the monster is sneaking up behind him. And it's invaders from Mars kind of thing. But I really like the shape of the shadow, and the shapes of the leaves. They're really completely different, and yet they work together. Shall I go forward?
Please.
Yes.
So this is a Lensbaby shot showing just how little a photograph can be about with a Lensbaby. These flowers, these are Hawkeye. The bigger one might be an inch across. So this is a 2-inch photo. And it's got such a shallow depth of field in here that the pollen on the front of the flower and the stamens there, or the pistils, whichever they are, is sticking out of the plane of focus in the image. And what's really in sharp focus is the little tiny tips of the leaves all the way around with their little pink edges. And they give such a texture to this. And again, 3/4 of the image is this just absolute broad brush, out of focus, abstract thing that just makes the rest of the photo by filling it all in.
You'd never know how tiny they are in real life. I have to say something here is that David is something of a mushroom connoisseur, but this one is not for the dining room table.
Well, this one is consumed sometimes, but for purposes other than food, we'll say. Don't mess with these. They're the color of a monarch butterfly for a reason. They're warning you that they're poisonous. But the color contrast, the dynamics of this, and the rain with the moisture on top of it and all, this is a perfectly good floral shot without a flower. So it doesn't absolutely have to be a flower to justify photography.
Celebrate bokeh.
Yeah, what I said when we were going through this in advance, I described this image as, if this were a full focus, full depth focus image, this would be a photo about dirt. Because if you look at it, the majority of the image is of soil, and you would just get lost in the texture of that soil and the detail of that soil. And this is all about the rarity of a yellow lady slipper, and they're very rare.
And the soft texture in the background really helps you to focus where you're supposed to.
Yeah, even the plant is mostly off into the unfocused zone. So there is a geometry to a sunflower. It is incredibly centered and obvious and blatant, and yet here we've created our own geometry. We've made a quarter arch, like the supports on the side of Notre Dame Cathedral, out of this sunflower simply by choosing to come in close and crop it.
Yeah, and that's something to think about. I'm going to go off the page for a moment. It's sort of like a portrait where you come in close on the face and you don't necessarily include the top of the person's head or the bottom of their chin. Everybody knows that stuff is there, and what you're really interested in is something else, something more intimate, something that's a little bit closer and a little bit of a different view of life. And that's what David's done here with this image, is to come in closer and sidestep the cliche and show you a little bit of the sunflower reaching for the sun. And I think that's really a nice way to compose this kind of subject.
So here we have flowers are almost all of them out of gamut colors. I mean, they're brilliant not to attract people. Well, the newer ones have been developed that way, but the natural reason was to attract bees and other animals with color vision. A color vision out of our range. Sometimes we don't even know what they're seeing because it's out someplace off in the infrared. So here are tulips as a low-pro shot. Now, they were low-saturation tulips, but you know I've messed with this. Look at the greens on the stems. And yet this is very satisfying. You don't have to have fluorescently saturated. You don't every time you take a floral shot, you don't have to grab the saturation slider and crank it to the right. In this image, I actually cranked it to the left, and look what I got. You know, that's a very satisfying floral image. It's now more about the texture, it's more about the contrast, and very subtle color.
Also, very subtle transitions from the brighter areas to the shadow areas. So your mid-tone transitions here are just superb. That's something to think about for other photographs, is how do you achieve those kinds of mid-tone transitions where they don't fall off abruptly, but they help you describe the shape of something that's very subtle. Well, something to take away with you.
Light on forms in space. I'll say it one more time.
The infamous texture shot.
Yeah, I call these texture shots. The shots that don't have, you know, a main theme or a subject area that, and again, graphic designers love these. But I actually printed this large and put it in my portfolio box because I was so happy to have finally found a Tuscan field of sunflowers that was fully in flower, and the sun was behind it, and the heads glowed, and there was something tall enough for me to stand on to get above it, and I had a long lens to compress it, and I got everything I wanted, and I was very satisfied with the shot. And then I looked at it and said, but it's not really a fine art shot. And yet I put it in my fine art portfolio box, and I've never been able to take it out because every third person who looks at it just goes into this emotional swoon, which is the goal of photography, is to move people. And all the techniques we use are just tools towards moving people because, you know, the only way you sell photos is when you transport the person who looks at the image. And this transports enough people that I can't afford to take it out on the portfolio.
Now this is from Tuscany, right?
Yeah, no question.
Oh, I just was looking at it and thinking how nice it would be to come home to this every night. And I also very much like it's almost like a storytelling, a bit of storytelling here with the way the stairs start here and then bring your eye back to an invisible landing and then to the door. And of course there's a curtain or a sunshade here. But it's just a very, very nice progression up the stairs and into the house.
It's a very human progression because your eye follows the path a person would follow, and it enjoys the flowers along the way the person walking up the stairs would enjoy them. So the story being told here is very real.
Yeah. It's a very, very important place for somebody. Well, that's the end of today's session. I want to remind you that our sponsors today were Datacolor.com. That's a big thank you to Lensbaby.com. We have a winner for the lens cal. Who is it, David?
Well, I don't have that information up. I think Patty probably has done that for us, and we'll wait for her to give us an answer.
Okay, we'll have that in a moment. Also want to remind you that there's a 20% discount off all Datacolor products purchased at Datacolor.com. Your promotional code is FLORA20. It's valid from the 27th to March 6th. I'm David Saffir. My blog address is provided here, davidsaffir.wordpress.com. There's a lot of tutorials and instructional information on there that you can take advantage of. I do answer questions for students, so if you care to send me an email, please do at dsaffir@mac.com. Please keep in mind I get a lot of emails. If I don't see your email right away, just give it 24 hours and send it again. My co-presenter is David Tobie, and he also has an excellent blog, cdtobie.wordpress.com, and I strongly encourage you to visit that website as well. And again, thanks to Datacolor and Lensbaby. We have a webinar coming up next week on iPhone photography. And do we have a winner?
Well, I've not been able to find it anywhere, so the answer is
You didn't send it to you on chat.
Okay, on chat and go to webinar. I'm afraid I'm lost in the technicalities of this. So I have so many questions and answers here that I'm not seeing hers.
Okay. Well, what will happen is our colleague at the home office will send an email to the person who's won the lens cal. You'll see that today, And
wait. The name is, drumroll please, Lou Ross.
Lou Ross is the winner.
So if you filled in an email address, Lou, then Patty will contact you at that address and get your mailing address to send you your Spider Lens Cal.
So we have a whole series of webinars going on all year, a couple a month, different subjects, advanced, intermediate, beginner, you name it. So keep in touch with us, and we hope to have your participation again.